Pingfan, northern China. Home to Unit 731, the world's first biological warfare complex. Built by the Japanese 60 years ago, this is all that remains of one of the century's most murderous collaborations between soldiers and scientists. The mastermind behind Unit 731, General Shiro Ishii. An army doctor, he believed biological weapons were so powerful that the normal course of medicine to save life should be reversed.
There's a term in Latin, hostis humanis generis, enemy of all humankind. A person who develops biological weapons is hostis humanis generis.
Today, the human race is still threatened by the germ warfare first pioneered at Unit 731. Imperial Japan in the 1930s, a nation mobilized for war. For Shiro Ishii and the generals who backed him, developing biological weapons was a scientific and patriotic adventure. "I beseech you," he told his men, "to pursue this research based upon the double medical thrill. One, as a scientist exerting every effort for the truth in natural science, and two, as a military person." Sadayoshi Nakamura was one of 3,000 medics secretly drafted to Pingfan. Their mission, to turn common illnesses like cholera and dysentery into weapons of mass murder.
不細工な建物ばかり建ってね、妙なとこだなとしか感じなかったです。一般の歩兵部隊だとかね、工兵部隊入れば工兵部隊の特徴でね、車があって特殊な兵ね、重機が並んでるけども、これ731部隊は何をやる部隊なのか、何したのか、車には全部衣がかかってしまってるし、随分ひどいところに来たもんだなとそう感じただけです。
Unit 731 was a secret community covering over 800 acres. It had its own barracks, airfield and laboratories. At its center, the main research building.
助教授、講師、このクラスの細菌学者、病理学者、これらでしたので、2階3階に行くと大学の微生物学教室とかそのようなこともあったと思いますけれども、しかしやってることはそれとは正反対、人を殺すためのことをやっておったわけですので。
Tokyo. Japanese sources charged that their troops near Peking were fired on near the Marco Polo Bridge and replied with machine gun fire. The Japanese foreign minister stated that his government expected an early adjustment of this difficulty. He attributed this incident to the lack of discipline among the Chinese.
Finding efficient ways to kill people was of particular interest to the Japanese High Command. In 1937, Japanese troops invaded China. Using only conventional weapons, they soon overran Chinese resistance. But Japan's leaders saw that biological weapons might provide a cheap and lethal way to keep the Chinese under control and expand their new empire throughout the Far East. Japanese doctors and scientists were ordered to find ways of turning disease into a weapon. But the study of vaccines and bacteria was still quite a new science. The idea of using them as weapons posed new questions. Which disease should you use? How long would germs survive if you scattered them in the open? And how could you produce enough of them to supply the Imperial Japanese Army? The first task for scientists at Unit 731 was to develop an efficient system of germ cultivation. They soon did.
腐乱室がありました。また妖怪窯というの、それと培養管を冷却する場所、これらがあって、それを全部チェーンコンペアで結んでました。このような最近の製造工場ということになってますけど、この中で使ってたものはですね、石式培養管というものです。
Bacteria like plague and cholera were mixed with meat and broth and spread out in trays. Yoshio Shinazuka's job was to rake off the scum of new bacteria that grew on top after a couple of days in an incubator.
腐敗臭のような、また細菌独特のですね、匂い、また個別的には細菌によって匂いが違うんですけれども、一般的にやはり腐敗臭というのがありました。
The unwitting guinea pigs for this new research were Chinese civilians. To check their germs were lethal, the Japanese scientists at Unit 731 secretly planted their new bacteria in the water supplies of local towns and villages. If disease broke out, the Chinese were meant to think it was a natural epidemic and that the Japanese were there to help. Among those involved in the campaign of misinformation to fool the Chinese was Tsuro Nishijima.
いう計画が立ったらですね、でその巻く方位、そのスパイを入れて、それでこの奥の方でその赤痢が流行ってると、だから用心せんとあかんっていうような宣伝をずっとやらしておくわけ。それで赤痢を巻くわけで。
9-man teams were sent out into the countryside to spread the bacteria manufactured at Unit 731. These death squads were also ordered to get scientific evidence that their germs were doing the job. It was vital they got fresh samples. This would mean dissecting Chinese civilians while they were still alive. In one of these groups was Sergeant Sadayoshi Nakamura.
民族は住まいしているので、そういうんでなくて、ポツンポツンポツンとね、うちが立ってる井戸のある場所を先に選んでくれてあるわけです。そこへ我々が車で連れて行かれるということで、その井戸水の中にそういうんでなくて、ポツンポツンポツンとね、それから3日か4日の潜伏期間を置いてまた行って、そしたら皆発病していますから、そして戻って発病しているっていうふうになると、今度次から次全身麻酔をかけて、そしてあと機械の方は機械の方で解剖終わったらきれいに塗り上げて、そしてあと注射打っちまうんだから。注射ということは毒殺ですね。そして缶に入れて掘った井戸に投げちまうんだから。
The samples Nakamura took were sent back to Pingfan for analysis. The villages he'd visited were destroyed. "30 people died as Nakamura cut the samples from their bodies. From a scientific point of view, the tests were a stunning success. The dead villagers proved that mass-produced germs could kill, and kill quickly.
After 477 death-dealing days, Japan is master of a land laid waste.
But despite these successes, at the end of the 1930s, it was still conventional weapons that held sway on the battlefield. If their bacteria were to be of any use in a modern war, the scientists at Unit 731 would have to find ways of delivering them on target. At Pingfan, General Ishii decided to practice on Chinese prisoners, but in such secrecy, even local Chinese would have no idea what was happening. Jinglan Ji only found out in 1937, when the Japanese arrested her husband.
托的是哈尔滨宪兵队的一个翻译，打听朱子营他们的消息。这个翻译呀，那个时候人吧，他抽大烟，我父亲花不少钱买大烟给他送礼，他就给打听消息。后来他就告诉我，说是这个他们牡丹江这些人呐，已经说是我问他有没有叫朱子营的，说有。 说是送到平房大监狱去了，我这一听说送平房大监狱去了，他就是这么告诉的。
Over 3,000 Chinese were brought to Unit 731 in sealed wagons and taken secretly to the research building at the center of the complex. The cover story for Ping Fan was that it was a lumber yard, so the Japanese referred to the prisoners as maruta, logs. Thinking it was a normal prison, Jinglan Ji went to Ping Fan on her own to try and bring her husband some food.
往前走，我也找不到那个平房的大监狱，前边有一个老头儿，那个老头儿吧，我也没看他是捡粪的呀，是捡柴火的。完我就问他，我说老大呀，我说我跟你打听个道啊。他说你要上哪去？ 我说我要找平房大监狱，我一说大监狱，这个老头吧挺吃惊的，就上下打量我，说姑娘啊，你找监狱干什么？我说因为我的亲人吧，他们给送这里头来了，我来看。
Inside, each prisoner was given a number from 1 to 200. Scientists could use as many men as they wanted for their experiments. Once they'd killed 200, the system would start again at number 1. If any of the Japanese objected, they were beaten or shot. There was no escape for them either.
ただ命令指示に従ってるだけで、自分の意思というのを全く左右できない社会ですから、軍隊というとこは。だから。 命令もしくは指示されたことだけに動いているだけです。一種の物や道具と同じです。自分の意思が少しでも働くと罰則が適用されますんで、むしろ私どもはその方がおっかないんです。
どうもこんなところにいつまでもおるとこやないと。 ところがね、やめさせてくれ言うたってなかなかやめさせてくれないんですよ。そういうような舞台やからね、秘密が外に出てバレたらここは悪いでしょ。
Tsuro Nishijima was a meteorologist at Ping Fan's main testing ground, helping to develop ways of spreading disease from the air. Today, he's still a keen amateur weatherman. Nishijima provided details of wind speed and direction, so Japanese pilots could spray bacteria over Chinese prisoners.
だいたい1回にそうですね、15人か20人ぐらい連れて行ったんじゃなかったですかね。それで5メーターから10メーター大きいぐらいに大きな木の杭が打ってあるんですが、線路の枕木みたいなもんがね、ポンポンポンとこう打ってあって、でそこへね、後ろ手にこう手錠かかったね丸太を連れてきて、それでまたそこへくぐるわけです、逃げられんようにね。それで順番にずっとこうその棒にくぐりつけてあったんですね。 それで上から飛行機でばらまくんですけどね、その時は上向けっちゅってもう銃を持って特別班いうのがついてましてね、もう一人に一人ついてるんですよ。それでこうして上向かしてそのばらまいた細菌を吸うようにねやってましたしね。
As the prisoners sickened and died, Japanese doctors made careful measurements of their decline. Anthrax, bubonic plague, glanders, Q fever were all charted. The course of infection was shown in meticulous hand-coloured illustrations. The corpses were all burnt, among them the husband of Jing Lanji.
哎呀，他说：“姑娘啊，你可不能去呀，那个地方啊，你到不了跟前儿，让日本兵发现了，被你抓进去，你就没有命了。”完了，我听他这一说，我也挺害怕呀。那个老头说：“你千万你可不能去呀，姑娘啊，你快回去吧。”结果你搁哪来？我说我搁我妈他们来，你快回去，你可不能去。叫他这一说呀，吓得我也不敢往前走了，我就。
Look carefully at this man. He's the Emperor of Japan, whose forces have committed the appalling atrocities against British Empire and Chinese troops, and civilians, men and women in Hong Kong.
As the Japanese swept through the Far East, news of their experiments leaked out. They were building germ warfare centers in Manchuria, Western China, Burma, Thailand, and Singapore. Soon, Japan wasn't the only country looking into germ warfare. In 1942, Alan Younger witnessed the first test of a British biological weapon.
The Japanese were thought to have used some form of biological warfare. So if they could do it, the Germans certainly could. And we wanted to know whether it was practicable, and if so, what precautionary measures should be taken in case it was used against us.
Grenard Island lies in Grenard Bay on the northwest coast of Scotland. It was here in 1942 that the very first scientifically controlled BW field trials were carried out.
The film scientists made of the tests was classified till 1997. The disease they were testing was anthrax, a lung infection that could kill in 3 days. British scientists used sheep to see if anthrax spores inside a bomb would be strong enough to survive an explosion and then infect anyone nearby. The sheep were immobilized and left downwind from the test device. Alan Younger helped prepare the anthrax bomb.
The decision having been taken that the bomb would be set off, I was called into the Hartway experiments where the experimental staff worked by Dr. Henderson, and he asked me to hold this bomb whilst he filled it with anthrax. Now, at the time, I didn't know much about anthrax. I'm no doctor, but of course I knew that it was deadly stuff. However, he must have known that there was no chance of any germs coming out and being breathed in by me, because I certainly didn't wear a gas mask or anything. So I held it, and he poured in this thick soup into the bomb, and then screwed on a base on it, and then it was ready. It was a very small explosion, just enough explosive to break open the bomb. And there was a puff of what looked like smoke, and that was it. And then this smoke was dispersed downwind and was completely invisible after, just a few seconds.
On the third day after exposure, the casualties begin. Dead sheep can be seen further down the line. It is, of course, necessary to confirm that they've died of anthrax. This can be done by simply making a blood film. Most of the animals, however, were given a more thorough post-mortem. Results were very satisfactory and confirmed lab figures.
The dead sheep were disposed of on the island. In a letter to the Prime Minister, the government chief scientist, Lord Cherwell, wrote that anthrax, codenamed N, could be used to contaminate entire cities for generations. It was a disease for which there was no known cure.
Knowing the deadliness of these germs, it's difficult to play down the importance of these tests. I mean, if this became a practicable weapon and it was then possible to drop an anthrax bomb on London, clearly the result would be absolutely catastrophic. When it was found to be workable, I think the only way, the best way of describing it is that gas warfare, which we knew a lot about from the First World War, is to biological warfare what ordinary explosive is to an atomic explosion. The biological warfare is 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 times more effective. And gas warfare is dangerous enough, but this is absolutely deadly.
The British never put their germ bombs into mass production. There weren't enough spare factories, and there was always the danger of a German air raid. But Japanese scientists had all the space and materials they needed to continue their quest for an efficient plague bomb. Throughout 1940, Pingfan scientists had conducted major field tests using modern weapons. The most successful was the so-called Uji bomb, which contained spores of anthrax. By the end of the year, some 4,000 Ujis had been tested. They were also experimenting with ways of delivering bubonic plague by air. Plague bacteria are delicate organisms, easily destroyed when delivered by normal weapons like sprays or bombs. The Japanese solved this problem by breeding thousands of plague-infected rats and collecting their fleas. If the fleas were dropped from an airplane, the germs could survive long enough to infect and kill the human enemy. In 1940, the city of Ningpo was still held by Chinese nationalists. That October, a Japanese bomber appeared overhead, carrying a stock of plague-infected fleas. One of those who saw it was Chan Guifa. Wu Yuanzhang was the doctor in charge of city quarantine regulations.
1940年10月、11月宁波发生楚月这个时候了，整个宁波市人心惶惶，都是很紧张。所以我当时在我医院里边呢，看病的人也是特别多。而我自己呢，因为我是海关的港口检阅官，所以我自己感觉到责任都非常之重大。因为这个楚月呢，宁波从来没有发生过，而且来势这么凶猛，死又死得这么快。
As panic spread, the plague victims were taken to a temple outside the city. It was quickly converted into an isolation hospital. Chan Guifa, now the only survivor of the attack, was among the patients.
13年来起来的辰光呢，
多少种的衣裳全部找好了，但是眼睛呢都是那玻璃像现在个塑料玻璃搿么讲多，搿眼看看配眼药打眼睛，搿么搿些个药，还有呢，有些古代带进来了，古代带进因为这古代组装来不及嘛，甚至有2个人捡了一块古材，2个人捡了一块古材以呢，就是上头叫眼石灰水以后，就把它抬出来了，到抬了搿种事。那么搿辰光啦，我已经有2多人了，2多人等了来，等了呢，搿辰光西人即刻将抬进抬出，抬进抬出，但是呢数目勿晓得，因为我当时人少了。
One cargo of plague-ridden fleas had killed 500 people and created terror in Ningpo. It was proof that germ weapons, however crude, were beginning to work. In their quest for even more resilient bacteria, the scientists at Unit 731 used their Chinese prisoners as living incubators. They reasoned that any bacteria which had overcome a body's natural defenses would be more powerful than the original strain.
軍医が来ましてね、ロツの外へ間隔が15センチまでないと思いますけれども、丸太の隙間がありまして、そこから腕を出して、もちろん消毒をして注入すると、こういうことです。細菌を作ってしまうと、いわゆる細菌工場、人間をこう細菌作りのものとして使うということでやったんだと思います。
With the prisoners chloroformed, Hiroshi Matsumoto helped drain the blood from their bodies so the new bacteria could be extracted.
血液が終わってきますとタラッタラッというふうにもう今にも止まりそうな状態になるんですが、同行した兵隊にこの胸部ここへ乗らして、このグクッグクッという音がするほど、両足で踏みつけるわけです。ですからおそらくこの肋骨を折るような形で心臓も圧迫をすると。そうしますと今までたらりで止まりそうになったところから管から気泡状態、ガブッガブッというのは音と同時に空気の玉と一緒にこのコーヒーの中へ落ちていくと、そういうこのことって一滴たりとも残さないと、こんな絞り踏み出すやり方ですね。
3,000 prisoners died at the hands of Japanese doctors. Most of their names are still unknown. But they died for nothing. Japan's biologists had been given all they wanted to produce a war-winning superweapon. They failed to do so in time. American scientists beat them to it with the atomic bomb. In August 1945, Imperial Japan surrendered.
Suddenly the news flies over the field. MacArthur is coming. GI sprint for ringside seats. Here is an epic moment of history. In his own words, it's been a long, hard road, but this looks like the payoff. His old corncob pipe between his teeth.
Alongside the military, American scientists rushed to Japan to make a thorough inventory of its wartime scientific achievements. retreating Japanese troops had tried to destroy all evidence of the biological warfare program, but it was impossible to cover up. Even before 1945, captured soldiers had told the Americans the rumors about General Ishii and Unit 731. Ishii himself had gone into hiding. His headquarters at Pingfan was blown up by his troops. But there were unconfirmed reports that all the test results had been shipped back to Tokyo. The American occupiers faced conflicting pressures. Justice demanded that Japanese biologists be put on trial for crimes against humanity. But the Americans were terrified that the Soviet Union might get its hands on a decade's research into BW, biological warfare. Bill Patrick joined the American program after the war.
Remember, these were entirely different times. The experience in Europe in 1945 was that the Russians and the United States were in competition for the rocket scientists, and we did not want to see this occur in the BW program that the Japanese had had. So we sent 2 pathologists over to Japan, and they brought back several truckloads of data, massive amounts of information.
The final report sent back in 1947 stressed that this field represents data which has been acquired by Japanese scientists at the expenditure of many millions of dollars and years of work. Such information couldn't be obtained in our own laboratories because of scruples attached to human experimentation. It is hoped that individuals who voluntarily contributed this information will be spared embarrassment because of it, and that every effort will be made to prevent this information falling into other hands. General Ishii persuaded America to make a deal.
In Tokyo, the trial of the principal Japanese war criminals began this May under the presidency of Sir William Webb. They're accused of waging wars of aggression and committing wholesale murders.
When the Tokyo war crimes trials opened in May 1946, biological warfare did not feature among the Japanese atrocities considered. Neither Ishii nor any of his scientists were among the accused. American officials hushed up the scandal of Unit 731 in exchange for the Japanese scientific reports. General Shiro Ishii died at home of throat cancer in 1959. Neither he nor any of his colleagues were ever called to account for their crimes by the United States. Today in Tokyo, there's a memorial to the officers and men of Unit 731. There is none for their victims. The only records of their death were shipped to biological research labs in America.
You are in Fort Detrick, where some 600 military and civilian scientists work together in research at the Army Biological Laboratories to protect this country against a biological...
Ishii had struck a good bargain. The Americans found the Japanese reports much less helpful than expected.
Very little of it was comprehensible to us and data that could be used effectively in our own program. Their results were truly crude by any measure of standard. And although they used a lot of humans in their experimentation, the data was not first rate. They were putting out tremendous amounts of energy and effort into the program, but their methods of producing their agents were crude. Their methods of disseminating their agents was even cruder. And although they had an anthrax bomb that they had developed, it was not very effective.
Despite the failure of the Japanese, an Allied report predicted that given time, biological weapons could be 100 times more effective. Some American scientists began investigating whether it was possible to make a germ weapon as lethal as an atom bomb. And if so, how could they guard against it? Others pursued ways of using disease to wage war in a less destructive, more humane way, not killing the enemy, just making him sick. Joe Jemski worked at the US Army labs at Fort Detrick.
Beauty of the BW was that if you got a person sick, somebody had to take care of him. If you infected somebody with an agent that killed them, you're dead in 3 days, they bury you, and this person or two persons, they were free to do what they want. But a sick person will take 4 to 6 people to take care of them. And you need a facility. Now, facility needs support personnel. So incapacitated agent, or agent that would make somebody sick but not necessarily kill them, is fine in tying up the opponent's forces, really. So that was a big advantage, and it doesn't hurt real estate, too. That's the other point, against nuclear warfare.
Throughout the 1950s at the Dugway test site in Utah, scientists pursued various ways of making the enemy sick.
The trial runs conducted at Dugway duplicate the actual conditions in the event.
It was a quest that at times led to unlikely suggestions.
At the time that a group of irregular forces landed in Cuba in order to overthrow the Castro regime, there was a proposal within the Chemical Corps to spray a non-lethal biological agent on the beaches. And the idea was that all the Castro forces would get headaches and diarrhea and upset stomachs, and we would be able to advance and save casualties, both theirs and also the defending Cubans. Well, men who have diarrhea seldom retreat. What they do is they dig in and keep shooting, because they don't want to be taken prisoner either. But you don't have to move, you don't have to walk to stay in your foxhole and keep shooting. The one thing you can't do if you have terrible stomach cramps is walk.
Castro's forces were spared American headaches. The Chemical Corps' suggestion was never taken up. But biological weapons were fast becoming a fact of Cold War military planning.
Good morning. Here's the news. Civil Defense Headquarters announced today that the sharp increase in the number of cases of illness during the last few days have led authorities to suspect that a biological warfare attack may have taken place.
At the height of the Cold War, the US government was at pains to play down the threat of biological attack from the Soviet Union.
If such an announcement is made in your city, don't give way to fear. Just remember that scientists would already be working to control the outbreak.
In fact, scientists on both sides were making great progress with the project that had proved beyond the Japanese, the invention of a BW weapon as lethal as the atom bomb. The key was finding the right way to spread the bacteria. In the 1960s, Bill Patrick was in charge of developing new agents at Fort Detrick.
Right after World War II, we were using explosive energy to disseminate our material, our agents. And explosive energy is relatively easy to do, but from the biological point of view, from the standpoint of the organism, it represents a terrible waste of organism. So we at Detrick learned that we had to develop literally the science of aerobiology.
Aerobiology meant studying how bacteria would behave when sprayed as a very fine cloud. How big should the particles be? How long would they survive? How far would they travel before settling out? To find out, in 1948, American scientists built the world's largest test chamber. Joe Jemski was in charge of experiments in what they called the 8-ball.
Now, if the test sphere was to be used efficiently, the most effective way to get quantitative measurements of this organism was to have it dispersed uniformly throughout the sphere.
The test sphere was used to study a variety of diseases. Again, anthrax, studied by every country interested in biological weapons, proved one of the most powerful. The next step for American scientists was to discover the lethal dose.
We had exposed almost 2,000 monkeys and determined that it would take roughly 3,000 spores of anthrax to kill 50% of the monkey. But this anthrax is an unusual organism because of the diversity it expresses in how it infects or kills other animals. It takes 50,000 spores to kill 50% of guinea pigs. Mice maybe take only 100 spores. It's impossible, as far as we are concerned, to kill a rat, to have the rat inhale an adequate number of spores to kill him. We just can't seem to do it. The ultimate goal was try to determine, if we could, how many organisms or spores would be required to cause the death of a human being. We obviously couldn't run human beings in our experiments. So where does man fit in? Is man more like a monkey or a mouse or a rat?
To overcome this uncertainty, scientists made sure their offensive weapons carried many times any conceivable lethal dose. As long as you went for overkill, you could now contaminate entire cities for generations. American strategists began to consider including biological weapons in their war plans.
We had the weapons, we had warheads, we had spray tanks with biological loads. There were various use concepts. One use concept was that if a nuclear war should come and the United States were to use nuclear weapons on cities, that we would spray biological weapons out beyond the range of the nuclear weapons so that people who were trying to escape from the radiation would be infected with the biological weapons.
By 1969, I feel very strongly that we had demonstrated the feasibility of biological warfare as a weapon system, We had done aerosol tests first in chambers, and later these tests were, large-scale tests were conducted in the Pacific. Some of these tests are still classified, and I can't tell you the details about these tests. But I can assure you that the results that we obtained from these tests demonstrated that biological warfare was and could be a very viable system.
The dream of a biological superweapon had become a reality. But now the Americans began to think again about whether they actually needed it. Above all, why should a superpower with its own hugely expensive nuclear warheads create biological weapons that were so cheap and easy for other countries to copy?
It seems to me so obvious that cheap weapons of mass destruction are not good for anybody, and certainly not good for the world's richest country. And second, that it's not good for our species. And being cheap, you know, if you were president of the United States and someone came into your office and said, "Sir, I've just learned how to make hydrogen bombs for a nickel each," would you say, "That's wonderful, we're going to save a few $1 billion," or would you lock the man up in your closet until someone could figure out what to do with him? Well, I'd lock him up, even though I know it would be improper to do that. But a 5-cent hydrogen bomb, if that were true, of course it's ridiculous, but if it were true, I mean, that's certainly not what the world needs.
Therefore, I have decided that the United States of America will renounce the use of any form of deadly biological weapons that either kill or incapacitate. Our bacteriological programs in the future will be confined to research in biological defense on techniques of...
By 1970, the United States had stopped all research on offensive germ warfare. The 8-ball was shut down, and 400 scientists were taken off the program. But the Americans couldn't stop what they'd helped create. 104 countries, including the Soviet Union, joined the US and signed a convention banning germ warfare. It seemed a triumph for those scientists who'd campaigned against biological weapons. But international treaties failed to put the genie back in the bottle. The Soviet Union secretly expanded its biological program. 5,000 scientists were employed to make even more deadly strains of plague and anthrax. Targeted at Europe and America, long-range missiles were equipped with biological warheads. Russia may well be working on biological weapons today. An even greater threat comes from smaller countries like Iraq. One of the UN inspectors sent there after the Gulf War, Bill Patrick, is convinced that what the Japanese started at Unit 731 is far from over.
I think that scientists that are in countries such as Iran, Iraq, North Korea, those countries that we call rogue countries, I think their scientists will work diligently on the developing whatever weapon system that, that their leaders prescribe. And that, of course, includes biological warfare.
In 1992, Iraq had over 200 missiles and bombs carrying anthrax spores, 200 of the 5-cent hydrogen bombs that Western governments had always feared. Evidence found by UN inspectors in Iraq shows that the appeal of a biological superweapon is as strong in the 1990s as it was 60 years ago. Not worth it for a superpower, but ominously attractive for third or fourth-rate powers trying to catch up.
I think that technology will always be used to create new and better weapons. And once a weapon has been established, I think at some point in time it will be used. I think that's just the way human nature works. It's not a very nice picture to comprehend, but I think that's the way it is.
At the end of the century, Japan is still the only nation to have used biological weapons in war. But the poor man's nuclear weapon is here to stay. Doctors and scientists of Unit 731 have bequeathed the world a vicious legacy.